It began with a rusted key, unearthed from the depths of a rotting chest that had been hidden in the attic of Ethan and Clara's newly inherited cabin. They'd come seeking solitude, a break from the chaos of their urban life. The cabin, nestled deep in the shadowy woods of Maine, had belonged to Ethan's estranged uncle, a man whose name was rarely mentioned and never with fondness. But the deed was now in Ethan's hands, and the property offered a refuge they desperately needed. The first night was calm, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. But as the moon rose high, a faint knocking came from beneath the floorboards. Ethan dismissed it as the groans of an old structure settling into the cool night. Clara wasn't so sure, but she didn't want to seem paranoid. The key came to them the next morning. Clara was exploring the attic, a maze of forgotten objects cloaked in cobwebs, when she stubbed her toe on the chest. Its leather straps were brittle with age, and when she managed to pry it open, the key sat on a small pillow of velvet, untouched by time. Beside it lay a crumbling piece of paper with 3 words scrawled in ink so faded it was nearly illegible. "Do not open." "Do not open what?" Clara asked aloud. Ethan shrugged as he examined the key. It was oddly heavy, its ornate bow carved with tiny, intricate runes. It felt warm in his hand, pulsing faintly as if alive. That evening, the knocking returned. Louder, more insistent. Clara insisted it was coming from beneath the living room. With a flashlight in hand, Ethan opened the hatch to the crawl space. He hesitated at the edge of the darkness, but curiosity got the better of him. The flashlight's beam revealed only dirt and a few scattered tools. He saw no rats or pipes that could explain the noise. But the moment Ethan closed the hatch, the knocking escalated into pounding. Clara was visibly shaken. "Maybe we shouldn't have taken the key," she said, staring at the fireplace where it now sat. Ethan, a skeptic by nature, laughed nervously. "It's just an old cabin. It's bound to creak and groan." That night, Clara woke to the sound of a woman crying. She shook Ethan awake, but the moment he sat up, the sound stopped. "You're dreaming," he mumbled, half asleep. She wasn't convinced. The following day, the cabin seemed darker. Even at noon, the sunlight couldn't quite pierce the canopy of the trees. Inside, shadows lingered in corners, moving subtly when no one was watching. Ethan suggested they go for a hike, but Clara refused to leave the cabin, certain something would happen if they did. By late afternoon, Ethan decided to investigate further. He returned to the attic, rummaging through boxes of decaying photos and forgotten heirlooms. He found letters addressed to his uncle, pleas from neighbors to stop his disturbing activities, veiled threats warning him to abandon his experiments. Ethan felt the air grow colder as he read, his breath visible in the dim attic light. When he descended, he found Clara sitting in a trance, staring at the fireplace. The key was gone. "Did you move it?" he asked. She didn't respond. That night, the pounding returned, accompanied by whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Ethan tried to shout over them, but his voice was swallowed by the cacophony. Clara pointed wordlessly to the hatch. It was open. A foul stench wafted from the crawlspace. Ethan grabbed his flashlight again, descending this time with shaking hands. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing claw marks in the dirt. Further in, he saw something metallic glinting in the light, a door embedded in the earth. The key's shape flashed in his mind. He bolted back upstairs. Clara was gone. Panicked, Ethan called for her, his voice echoing through the cabin. The whispers grew louder, now distinct voices, chanting in a language he couldn't understand. The floor beneath his feet felt soft, like sand, threatening to pull him under. Desperation drove him back to the hatch. He descended again, trembling, until he reached the door. It was ancient, reinforced with iron bands. The keyhole glowed faintly, as if beckoning him. "Do not open," the note had said. Ethan hesitated. Then he heard Clara's voice, faint and distorted, calling his name from beyond the door. He had no choice. The key turned smoothly in the lock. The moment it clicked, the chanting stopped. Silence hung heavy in the air, and for a brief second, Ethan thought it was over. Then the door burst open. A force like a hurricane threw him backward. From the darkness beyond the threshold, shapes began to emerge. Twisted, shadowy figures with glowing eyes and gaping mouths that oozed black ichor. They moved unnaturally, as if the world itself resisted their presence. And at their center stood Clara. Her eyes were empty sockets, her face a grotesque mask of torment. She opened her mouth, but her voice was no longer her own. "You were warned," she. or whatever she had become, said, "Now you'll join us." Ethan scrambled back, but the figures were relentless. The cabin groaned as if alive, the walls bleeding dark streaks of ichor. The last thing Ethan saw was the key, lying on the ground, its runes glowing faintly, as the figures dragged him into the abyss. When the authorities arrived weeks later, the cabin was empty. No sign of Ethan, Clara, or the mysterious door. Only the key remained, resting on the mantel, as pristine as the day it was made. It waits for the next curious soul.
Story number 2.
The radio crackled to life in the corner of the room, even though no one had touched it for years. It shouldn't have been possible. Its power cord hung lifelessly from the back, frayed and useless. Yet there it was, sputtering static, and beneath the white noise came something faint, like whispers from a distant world. Elliot glanced up from the faded map he had spread across the cabin's dining table, his heart skipping a beat. He'd come here to write, to escape the constant grind of city life, and to bask in the solitude offered by his late grandfather's remote woodland retreat. It was supposed to be peaceful. Now, peace was the last thing he felt. The cabin was old, impossibly old. Its logs were darkened by years of weather and time, and every surface inside bore marks of a life lived decades ago, his grandfather's life. Elliot barely remembered him, just the way his sharp gray eyes seemed to pierce through people, the stories he told about the land and its dark history. The radio spat static again, and then a voice came through, clear but unnatural. It sounded close yet impossibly far away. "Did you hear it yet?" Elliot froze, his breath caught in his throat. The voice didn't belong to anyone he recognized. It didn't even sound human. It was hollow, echoing like it was being funneled through miles of tunnels. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. The radio answered immediately, as though it had been waiting. "Do not look outside." Elliot's pulse raced. His eyes darted to the window by the front door. The curtains hung limp, the moonlight casting a pale glow across the room. Slowly, he stood and stepped toward the window, his hand trembling as he reached for the edge of the curtain. "Do not look," the voice screamed now, sharp and furious. Elliot flinched, his hand snapping back. The room fell silent, except for the radio's faint hum. He stayed rooted in place, staring at the window. He wasn't sure what terrified him more, the thought of seeing something outside, or the radio's inexplicable awareness of his actions. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time seemed warped here, like the world outside the cabin no longer existed. Eventually, Elliot turned off the light and made his way to the bedroom. He lay in the narrow bed his grandfather had once used, listening to the night's eerie quiet. He swore he could hear faint scratching at the edges of the cabin, like claws on the wooden exterior, but he told himself it was just the wind. He woke to the sound of footsteps overhead. The attic. He'd never even been up there, too unsettled by the idea of what might linger in the dark, cluttered space. But now, the footsteps were deliberate, pacing, as though someone or something was walking back and forth. Clutching a flashlight, Elliot climbed the narrow staircase leading up to the attic door. The air grew colder with each step, the scent of damp wood and something metallic filling his nostrils. His hands shook as he turned the knob and pushed the door open. The beam of light swept across the room. Old furniture, stacks of boxes, and a dozen other forgotten relics lay buried under thick layers of dust. Nothing moved. No footprints disturbed the grime-covered floor. Yet the air felt heavy, wrong. Elliot almost turned to leave when the flashlight's beam caught something. A figure, a woman, stood at the far end of the attic, her back to him. She wore a tattered dress that seemed to move unnaturally, as though caught in a breeze that wasn't there. "Hello?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The woman didn't turn. She only tilted her head slightly, as if acknowledging him. Elliot's breath quickened. Slowly, her head tilted further and further, until it shouldn't have been possible, until it was upside down. Her face came into view, pale and contorted with a grin too wide for her face, her eyes black pits that seemed to drink in the light. Elliot stumbled backward, nearly tumbling down the stairs. He slammed the attic door shut and ran back to the living room, gasping for breath. The radio crackled again. "You shouldn't have seen her," the voice said, dripping with malice. "Now she'll see you." A knock came at the front door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Elliot froze. He glanced toward the door, then the window, his mind racing. The radio's warning echoed in his head. "Do not look outside." The knocks came again, louder this time. The third set of knocks rattled the entire cabin, the door groaning on its hinges. Then, silence. For hours, Elliot sat paralyzed in the middle of the living room, clutching the flashlight like it was the only thing tethering him to sanity. He didn't dare move, didn't dare look outside. But when the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the curtains, he finally stood, trembling, and pulled them aside. The woods were still, empty. But etched into the frost on the glass was a single word scrawled in long, jagged letters. Tonight. That night, Elliot's screams echoed through the woods, but no one came to help. The cabin still stands there, empty now, but locals say sometimes if you walk too close, you'll hear the crackle of static, and beneath it a voice warning you not to look outside.
Story number 3.
It was a dare, plain and simple. 4 friends, Mia, Jordan, Sam, and Claire, stood at the edge of the abandoned trail leading to Blackthorn Cabin, a place whispered about in town for decades. The story went that a family had lived there in the 1930s, only to vanish without a trace, leaving the house in pristine condition, aside from the thick iron chains barring its doors. No one knew why, but locals spoke of screams that echoed from the woods on moonless nights, and shadows that moved behind the cabin's boarded windows. One night, that's all, Jordan said with a nervous laugh, gripping the flashlight. His bravado barely masked the tension in his voice. We go in, look around, prove the rumors are crap, and leave. Mia rolled her eyes. This is so stupid. I can't believe we're doing this. But Claire, the most skeptical of the group, smirked. It's just a creepy old cabin. Nothing's going to happen. The hike was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just the crunch of their boots on the narrow trail. When they finally reached the clearing, Blackthorn Cabin loomed before them, its sagging roof and darkened windows giving the impression of a slumbering beast. The iron chains were still there, coiled tightly around the front door, but one link had snapped cleanly in 2, leaving just enough space to squeeze through. Jordan hesitated but quickly recovered, pushing the door open with a groan. The air inside was stale and cold, carrying a faint metallic tang. The cabin's interior was unsettlingly clean. No dust, no cobwebs, just empty furniture and walls scarred with deep gouges that looked almost like claw marks. Someone's definitely been here, Sam muttered, pointing to a pile of half-burnt candles arranged in a crude circle on the floor. Weirdos doing rituals or something. Mia shivered, suddenly uneasy. Can we just look around and go? The group split up, exploring the small, single-story cabin. The rooms were sparse. A kitchen with rusted appliances, a living room with a crumbling stone fireplace, and 2 bedrooms with beds still made, as if waiting for their long-gone occupants. But then Claire screamed. They all rushed to find her standing in one of the bedrooms, pale and shaking. She pointed to the closet door, which was slightly ajar. "There's something in there," she whispered. Jordan, the self-appointed leader, grabbed a broomstick from the corner and pushed the door open. Inside was a mirror, tall and cracked, its frame carved with intricate, spiraling patterns. At first, it seemed ordinary, albeit creepy, but as they stared, the reflection in the glass began to shift. Their images didn't match their movements. Mia raised her hand to touch her face, but in the mirror, her reflection only stood still, staring at her with a cold, vacant expression. Then it smiled, a cruel, jagged grin that didn't belong to her. "Let's get out of here," Sam said, his voice rising. But as they turned, the door to the bedroom slammed shut. The light from Jordan's flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. A low, guttural sound began to rise from the mirror, like the grinding of stone against stone. Shapes began to move within the glass, shadowy figures writhing and twisting, their hollow eyes fixed on the 4 of them. One by one, the shadows began to peel away from the mirror, stepping into the room. Jordan fumbled with the flashlight, managing to bring it back to life. Its weak beam illuminated the figures, humanoid but wrong. Their bodies were unnaturally long, their limbs bending at impossible angles, their mouths wide and empty, stretching as though ready to swallow the room whole. "Run!" Mia screamed. The group bolted for the door, but the room seemed to shift around them, the walls bending and warping like liquid. The shadows followed, their long clawed hands swiping at the air, their guttural noises growing louder. Sam tripped, and one of the figures lunged for him, its claws digging into his ankle. He screamed as they dragged him back toward the mirror, his nails raking the floorboards. "Help me!" he cried, but the others couldn't stop. They burst through the door and into the main room, slamming it shut behind them. "Where's Sam?" Mia sobbed. Claire shook her head, too terrified to speak. Jordan grabbed Mia's arm, dragging her toward the front door, but the chains had somehow reappeared, wrapping tightly around the handle. The flashlight flickered again, and the shadows began to seep through the walls, spilling into the room like smoke. "Back door!" Jordan shouted. They sprinted toward the kitchen, but as they entered, the metallic tang in the air became overpowering. The walls began to bleed a thick, dark liquid, and the shadows were everywhere now, crawling across the ceiling, their hollow eyes unblinking. The back door was gone. Where it should have been was a solid wall. "We're trapped!" Claire screamed. The shadows closed in, their movements slow but deliberate. One by one, the flashlight dimmed, leaving only the faint glow of the mirror, which had somehow appeared in the center of the room, its cracked surface pulsating with a sickly light. "Don't look at it," Mia shouted. But it was too late. Claire's gaze locked onto the glass, and her body went rigid. Her reflection reached out, clawing at the inside of the mirror, and with a deafening crack, Claire was pulled inside, her scream cut short as the surface sealed over her like water. Jordan and Mia clung to each other, tears streaming down their faces. The shadows moved closer, their clawed hands outstretched. And then everything went black. The cabin was silent again when the search party arrived a week later. No trace of the four friends was ever found, but locals swear that if you get too close to Blackthorn Cabin at night, you can see their faces in the windows, staring back at you with vacant, lifeless eyes. And sometimes, if you're very unlucky, they'll smile.
Story number 4.
The storm rolled in faster than expected, turning the late afternoon sky into a swirling mass of black clouds. Sarah and her younger brother, Tommy, were already miles into the forest when the first drops of rain began to fall. They had set out early that morning to explore the trails near their family's vacation cabin, a ritual they'd shared since childhood. But this time, they'd taken a wrong turn. "We should head back," Sarah said, glancing nervously at the darkening sky. Tommy frowned, clutching the old compass he'd brought along. "The trailhead's just this way. I'm sure of it." But Tommy wasn't sure, not really. The woods seemed to shift as the storm grew stronger, the trees closing in like a living wall. By the time the rain started to pour, the trail had vanished entirely, swallowed by the thick underbrush. "Tommy!" Sarah yelled over the howling wind. "We need to find shelter." Lightning illuminated the forest, revealing a structure ahead, a cabin, its silhouette jagged against the backdrop of flashing skies. It looked abandoned, its roof sagging, the windows dark, but it was their only option. "Come on!" Sarah grabbed Tommy's arm and sprinted toward the cabin. The door creaked open with little resistance, revealing a single room lit dimly by the flashes of lightning seeping through the cracks in the wood. A table and 2 chairs stood in the center, covered in a layer of dust. Against the far wall was a stone fireplace, cold and unused for decades. "This place is creepy," Tommy muttered, his voice trembling. "Better than staying out in the storm," Sarah replied, though she couldn't shake the unease that crept up her spine. The air inside was damp and smelled faintly of mildew, but there was something else, something metallic and sharp, like rusted iron. As Sarah lit the old kerosene lamp they'd found near the fireplace, she noticed carvings on the wooden walls. Symbols, spirals, and strange runes covered nearly every surface. They weren't random. They were deliberate, almost ritualistic. "What is all this?" Tommy whispered, running his fingers over the jagged lines. "I don't know. Let's just wait out the storm and go home," Sarah said, but she could feel the cabin watching them, its shadows stretching too long, its silence too heavy. Hours passed, and the storm showed no signs of relenting. Sarah dozed off in one of the chairs, but Tommy stayed awake, staring at the carvings. He swore he saw them move in the flickering light of the lamp, the symbols shifting and writhing like they were alive. And then he heard it, a faint tapping. It came from the floorboards beneath him, rhythmic and deliberate. Tommy froze, his breath hitching as he strained to listen. The tapping grew louder, closer, until it stopped directly beneath his chair. "Sarah," he whispered, shaking her awake. She groaned, but sat up quickly when she saw the terror on his face. "What is it? Listen." For a moment, there was only the sound of rain against the roof. Then it came again, louder this time. The distinct sound of nails or claws scratching against wood, accompanied by a faint whispering, so low it was almost imperceptible. "Is someone under the floor?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Tommy pointed to a trapdoor near the fireplace, one they hadn't noticed before. It was small, with an iron handle, and looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. The whispering grew louder as they approached, voices overlapping, words in a language neither of them understood. "Don't open it," Tommy said, backing away. But Sarah, her curiosity outweighing her fear, pulled the trapdoor open. The whispers stopped instantly, replaced by a suffocating silence. The darkness beneath the trapdoor was absolute, a black void that seemed to pull the light from the room. "Hello?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling. A hand shot out of the darkness, pale, skeletal, its fingers impossibly long. It grabbed Sarah's wrist, pulling her downward with inhuman strength. She screamed as Tommy lunged forward, grabbing her other arm and trying to pull her back. "Don't let go," Sarah cried, tears streaming down her face. From the pit, a face began to emerge, a face that wasn't human. Its features were stretched and distorted, its eyes black pits that oozed a dark tar-like substance. Its mouth opened too wide, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. "Get away from her," Tommy shouted, grabbing a chair and smashing it against the hand. It released Sarah, retreating back into the pit with a guttural snarl. He slammed the trapdoor shut and dragged Sarah away. "We have to get out of here," Sarah gasped, clutching her wrist, which was now covered in deep red welts. But the cabin had changed. The front door was gone, replaced by another wall covered in symbols. The windows were no longer there, only solid wood where they had once been. "We're trapped," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. The carvings on the walls began to glow faintly, the symbols shifting and twisting as if alive. The whispering returned, louder now, filling the room with a deafening cacophony, and then the trapdoor creaked open on its own. From the darkness below, dozens of hands emerged, clawing at the edges of the opening. The thing they were attached to began to rise, a mass of writhing limbs and distorted faces, its body too large to fit through the trapdoor, but forcing its way through anyway. Its many mouths screamed in unison, a sound so terrible it made Sarah and Tommy's ears bleed. They ran to the far corner of the cabin, holding each other as the thing crawled closer. Its faces turned toward them, all grinning, all hungry. When the storm finally ended the next morning, the cabin stood silent. The search party found no trace of Sarah or Tommy, only the trapdoor, wide open, and the strange symbols etched into the walls. Locals say the cabin is still there, though no one dares to go near it. On stormy nights, they claim you can hear faint tapping and whispers, calling to anyone foolish enough to listen.
Story number 5.
The fog settled thick and low as Eric drove down the winding road, his GPS flickering and recalculating every few minutes. He cursed under his breath, glancing at the fuel gauge. Nearly empty. It wasn't supposed to be this hard finding the bed and breakfast his coworker had recommended. A charming spot in the middle of nowhere, perfect for getting away. Except now he was stranded. The road stretching endlessly ahead and behind, swallowed by the dense woods on either side. When the headlights illuminated a small weathered sign that read, "Hollow Creek Inn, Vacancy," Eric breathed a sigh of relief. He turned onto the gravel driveway, the car crunching noisily as the building came into view. It wasn't what he had imagined. The inn was a ramshackle two-story house with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The warm yellow light spilling from the windows was inviting, though, and Eric decided any shelter was better than spending the night in his car. The front door creaked open as he approached, the sound echoing into the still night. A woman stood in the doorway, her face partially obscured by shadows. She was pale, with unnaturally sharp features, her smile too wide for her face. "Welcome," she said in a voice that was soft yet strangely hollow. "You must be tired from your journey." Eric hesitated but managed a polite smile. "Yeah, a little lost too. Do you have a room?" "Of course. Come in." The inside was surprisingly cozy. Dim lighting, antique furniture, and the faint scent of lavender. The woman led him to the front desk, where she handed him an old-fashioned key. Room 4. Her hand brushed his as she gave him the key, and her skin was ice-cold. "Breakfast is at dawn," she said, her tone final. "Please, don't wander at night." Eric raised an eyebrow at the odd warning, but nodded. The staircase creaked under his weight as he climbed to the second floor, the air growing colder with each step. Room 4 was at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. He pushed it open, revealing a quaint room with a small bed, a dresser, and a single window. The decor was outdated but clean, and exhaustion outweighed his unease. As he prepared for bed, he noticed the window was stuck slightly open. He tried to close it, but it wouldn't budge. The fog outside seemed to press against the glass, swirling and shifting unnaturally. Eric decided to ignore it, pulling the thin blanket over himself and drifting into an uneasy sleep. He awoke to the sound of whispering. It was faint at first, like wind through the trees, but it grew louder, distinct words forming in a language he didn't understand. Eric sat up, his heart pounding. The whispers were coming from the hallway. Ignoring the woman's warning, he crept to the door and peeked out. The hallway was dark, the antique light fixtures barely flickering. Shadows moved at the far end, just out of reach of the faint light. They weren't human. They were too tall, too thin, their limbs bending and stretching as they floated silently. Eric backed into his room, shutting the door and locking it. He pressed his ear to the wood, but the whispers had stopped. Then the window rattled. Eric turned slowly, his blood running cold. The fog outside was gone, replaced by darkness. And in that darkness, a face stared back at him. A pale, gaunt face with empty black eyes and a mouth stretched wide in a grotesque grin. The window creaked open wider on its own, and the figure began to crawl through. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, its elongated arms gripping the sill. Eric stumbled backward, grabbing the dresser and shoving it against the window. The thing let out a guttural screech, its face twisting in fury as it clawed at the wood. The whispers returned, louder now, coming from every corner of the room. Shadows pooled on the floor, crawling up the walls, forming shapes that loomed over him. Eric grabbed his phone, frantically dialing 911, but there was no signal. The screen flickered, showing only static before going dark. Suddenly, everything stopped. The whispers, the shadows, the rattling, it all ceased. The room was deathly silent. Eric dared to look at the window. It was closed, the fog pressing against the glass once more. The dresser was back in place, as though nothing had happened. He glanced around the room, his pulse hammering in his ears. Had he imagined it? Morning couldn't come fast enough, he decided. Eric climbed back into bed, leaving the light on this time. But when he woke, the room was dark again, the air heavy with the scent of mildew. He checked his phone. 3:33 a.m. The whispers returned. Only this time, they came from inside the room. Eric sat up, his breath catching in his throat as he saw a figure standing at the foot of the bed. It was the woman from the front desk, her face pale and twisted into that same too-wide smile. Her eyes were solid black, like twin voids, and her head tilted unnaturally to one side. "You should have stayed in bed," she said, her voice a raspy whisper. Before Eric could scream, her shadow stretched forward, enveloping him in suffocating darkness. He felt himself being pulled, his body sinking into something cold and endless. When dawn came, the Hollow Creek Inn stood empty once more. The room Eric had occupied was pristine, his belongings neatly arranged, as though he had never been there at all. Travelers still report seeing the inn's sign on foggy nights, though it never appears in the same place twice. Those who stay never check out, their stories becoming whispers that drift through the endless woods, waiting for the next lost soul.
Story number 6.
The car broke down just as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving Lena and her fiancé Mark stranded on an isolated stretch of road surrounded by dense forest. The nearest town was miles away, and their phones had no signal. To make matters worse, the night was unusually cold for early autumn, the air sharp with the scent of damp earth. "We'll have to find somewhere to wait it out," Mark said, squinting into the growing darkness. Lena pointed to a faint light flickering through the trees. "What about that? Maybe someone there has a phone." The light belonged to a house, or what was left of one. It was an old Victorian mansion, its windows dark and its once grand facade covered in vines and moss. Yet the faint glow of a lantern hanging by the front door beckoned them. "This place doesn't look safe," Lena muttered, hesitating as they approached the rotting wooden porch. "We don't have a choice," Mark said, knocking on the door. The sound echoed ominously, but there was no response. "It's probably abandoned," Lena whispered, but Mark pushed the door open, revealing a dimly lit foyer. The inside was eerily pristine, as though someone had just cleaned. Dust-free furniture was arranged neatly, and a chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals gleaming faintly. Yet the air felt wrong, heavy, oppressive. "We'll just stay here for the night," Mark said. "Better than freezing out there." Lena reluctantly agreed, though every instinct screamed at her to leave. The two of them explored the house, finding a modest kitchen, a grand sitting room, and a staircase leading to the second floor. Each room was impeccably tidy, but strangely devoid of personal touches. No photographs, no books, nothing to suggest anyone had lived there in decades. As they settled in the sitting room, a loud creak echoed from above. "Old houses make noise," Mark said, trying to sound reassuring, but Lena noticed his knuckles whitening as he gripped the armrest. Another sound followed, a rhythmic thumping, like footsteps. They stared at the ceiling, their breaths held. The noise stopped suddenly, plunging the house back into silence. "That's it," Lena whispered. "We need to leave." Before Mark could respond, the chandelier above them began to sway. Slowly at first, then violently, as if something unseen was shaking it. Lena screamed as one of the crystals shattered, sending shards raining down. "We're out of here," Mark said, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the door. But when they reached the foyer, the door was gone. In its place was a solid wall, the peeling wallpaper crawling with dark stains. This isn't possible," Mark stammered. A low hum filled the air, growing louder, vibrating through the walls. It wasn't a sound but a feeling, something ancient and hungry pressing against their minds. Shadows began to spill into the room, pooling on the floor, writhing and twisting as they climbed the walls. The shadows formed shapes, tall, skeletal figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. They moved without sound, their heads twitching unnaturally as they turned toward Lena and Mark. "Run!" Lena screamed. They bolted up the staircase, the only direction left to go. The upstairs hallway stretched impossibly long, lined with doors that seemed to shift and multiply as they ran. One of the doors burst open and a figure stepped out, a man in a tattered suit, his face half obscured by shadows, his mouth stretched too wide, and he let out a guttural laugh that sent chills down Lena's spine. Mark grabbed the nearest door handle, throwing it open. They stumbled into a bedroom with a large, four-poster bed draped in crimson curtains. The walls were lined with mirrors, their surfaces cracked and fogged. "Block the door!" Mark yelled, shoving a dresser in front of it. But the mirrors drew Lena's attention. At first, she thought they were reflecting the room, but then she realized the images didn't match. In the mirrors, the bed was occupied. Figures lay under the sheets, motionless. One of them moved. "Mark?" Lena whispered, her voice trembling. "Look." The figures in the mirrors sat up slowly, their faces obscured by shadows. One of them turned toward Lena, its mouth opening wide enough to split its face in two. Its reflection began to climb out of the glass. The dresser behind them flew across the room as the door burst open. The skeletal figures from the hallway poured in, their movements jerky and insect-like. Mark grabbed a lamp and swung it at the nearest one, but it passed through the shadow harmlessly. "We're going to die here!" Lena cried. "No, we're not!" Mark grabbed her hand and dragged her to the window. He smashed it with a chair, revealing a sheer drop into the dark forest below. "Jump!" he yelled. Lena hesitated, but the shadows were closing in, their skeletal hands reaching for her. With a scream, she leapt, Mark following close behind. They landed hard, the impact knocking the wind out of them. Scrambling to their feet, they ran blindly into the forest, not daring to look back. The trees seemed to close in around them, the air thick with the hum of something unnatural. When they finally stumbled onto the road, the mansion was gone. In its place was an overgrown lot, the lantern extinguished. Mark turned to Lena, his face pale. "Was that real?" She didn't answer, staring at her reflection in the window of the car. Her face looked back, but her eyes were pitch black. From the shadows of the forest, the sound of guttural laughter followed them into the night.
Story number 7.
The train ride was supposed to be simple, a red-eye commuter line cutting through the countryside. Maya often took this route after late shifts, relishing the quiet of the nearly empty train cars. Tonight, however, something felt different. The station was eerily deserted, and the train arrived with an unsettling silence. No screeching brakes, no clatter of wheels, just a low hum, as though the train itself was holding its breath. Maya stepped aboard and chose a seat near the middle of the car. It was brightly lit but empty, except for an elderly woman sitting in the far corner, her head tilted forward as if asleep. The train doors slid shut without a sound, and the car jerked forward, moving at a slow, deliberate pace. Maya leaned her head against the window, staring out at the dark landscape. Forests and fields passed by in the pale glow of the moon, but there were no other lights. No homes, no street lamps, not even the faint red blink of cell towers. Just endless darkness. She glanced at her phone. No signal. The train stopped abruptly, throwing her forward in her seat. Maya looked around. The station outside was overgrown with weeds, the sign faded and illegible. She hadn't seen any announcements about unscheduled stops. The doors hissed open and a man in a suit boarded. His clothes were outdated, his tie too wide, his shoes polished to an unnatural shine. He sat down a few rows ahead of her without acknowledging her presence. The train started again. Maya glanced at the elderly woman, still slumped in her seat. The man in the suit sat perfectly still, his back rigid, staring straight ahead. Maya's unease grew as she realized something odd. The lights in the car weren't reflecting on the windows. The glass was dark, like staring into an abyss. She pulled out her earbuds, hoping music might distract her. But as soon as she hit play, the sound distorted. It wasn't static, it was whispering. Faint, overlapping voices speaking words she couldn't understand. She yanked the earbuds out and shoved her phone back into her bag. The train stopped again, this time in the middle of nowhere. No platform, no station, just dense, shadowy trees pressing against the tracks. The doors opened. No one boarded. The doors stayed open for several long moments, the cold night air seeping into the car. Maya leaned forward, peering down the aisle toward the open doors. Something moved just beyond the threshold, a dark figure, tall and thin, standing perfectly still. It was hard to tell if it was a person or a shadow. "Excuse me," she called, her voice shaky. "Are you getting on?" The figure didn't move. The train doors slammed shut, and the train lurched forward, picking up speed. Maya's heart raced as she glanced around the car. The man in the suit was still staring straight ahead, but his lips were moving now, as if muttering to himself. The elderly woman's head had turned slightly, her face hidden by her hair. The lights in the car flickered. Maya's reflection in the window wasn't her own. Her breath hitched as she stared at the glass. The face looking back at her was pale and gaunt, its eyes sunken and black. The reflection smiled, its lips peeling back to reveal jagged teeth. Maya whipped around, but there was nothing behind her. The man in the suit was still muttering, louder now, his words forming a rhythmic chant. The elderly woman was sitting upright, her head cocked at an unnatural angle, her mouth open wide in a silent scream. Panic overtook her. Maya stumbled to her feet and moved toward the door leading to the next car, but when she opened it, there was no train car beyond, just more darkness, stretching infinitely in all directions. The wind howled, pulling at her hair and clothes, but the train itself remained eerily silent. She slammed the door shut and turned back to the car. The man and the elderly woman were gone. The car was empty now, except for her. The lights flickered again and went out, plunging her into darkness. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping in an unbearable cacophony. Maya pressed her hands to her ears, but the voices were inside her head now, speaking in a language that felt ancient, unnatural. The train slowed, then stopped. When the lights came back on, the car was different. The seats were torn, the windows shattered. Dust and cobwebs covered every surface, and the air was heavy with the stench of decay. Maya looked around, her chest tightening as she realized she was utterly alone. She stumbled to the nearest door, prying it open. The outside was barren. No tracks, no trees, just an endless expanse of gray dirt under a swirling, ash-filled sky. Behind her, the whispers became a laugh, low, guttural, and filled with malice. She turned slowly, her eyes widening as she saw a figure standing at the far end of the car. It was impossibly tall, its limbs grotesquely elongated, its face obscured by a shifting black void. It took a step forward, then another, its movements jerky and deliberate. Maya ran. She leapt from the train, falling into the ash-covered ground below. When she looked back, the train was gone. The landscape stretched endlessly around her, the gray horizon swallowing everything. She started walking, the sound of laughter following her. When rescuers found the train 2 days later, it was parked at a disused station miles from any active line. The car was empty, covered in dust and cobwebs. Maya's belongings were still on her seat, untouched. She was never seen again, though passengers on that line sometimes report hearing faint whispers in the dead of night, just before the lights flicker out.
Story number 8.
It was late when Jonah's car crested the hill, the headlights slicing through the thick mist that seemed to swallow the narrow mountain road. His GPS chirped its last direction before the screen went blank, the signal lost. Ahead, a crooked wooden sign appeared out of the fog. Mosswood Pines, cabins for rent. Jonah cursed under his breath. This wasn't the highway. He must have taken a wrong turn. But with his fuel gauge dipping dangerously low and no other signs of civilization in sight, the cabins seemed like his only option for the night. The dirt path leading to the cabins was rough and overgrown, the trees pressing in from either side like skeletal sentinels. When he reached the clearing, Jonah was surprised to find a cluster of small cabins, their windows glowing faintly in the gloom. A weathered figure in a wide-brimmed hat stepped out from the shadows near the largest building, a lodge marked office. "Need a room?" the man asked, his voice gravelly but polite. "Yeah," Jonah replied, his unease growing. "Just for the night." The man handed Jonah an old-fashioned key, the number 5 stamped into the tarnished brass. His hand lingered for a moment, gripping Jonah's tighter than necessary. "Stay inside, no matter what you hear." Jonah frowned, but didn't argue. The man's warning only deepened his unease. Cabin 5 was at the far edge of the clearing, partially obscured by thick pine trees. The inside was simple but clean. A single bed, a table, and a wood stove that filled the air with the faint scent of smoke. He locked the door behind him, his exhaustion outweighing his nerves. Sleep came quickly, but it didn't last. Jonah woke to the sound of soft scratching, like nails against wood. At first, he thought it was a raccoon or some other animal nosing around, but then came a faint voice, barely audible through the thin walls. "Help me." Jonah froze, his breath catching in his throat. The voice was weak, tremulous like a child's. He slid out of bed, tiptoeing to the window. The fog outside had thickened, swirling like living tendrils. He saw nothing but shadow and mist. "Please, help me." The voice was closer now, just outside the door. Jonah hesitated. The old man's warning echoed in his mind. "Stay inside, no matter what you hear." But what if it really was a child? Swallowing his fear, he moved to the door and unlocked it. As he turned the knob, the scratching stopped. Silence pressed in around him. Jonah opened the door a crack, peering into the fog. His breath clouded in the cold air, but there was no one there. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling. The woods didn't answer. The fog seemed to thicken, like curling toward him like probing fingers. He quickly shut the door, bolting it this time. Back in bed, Jonah lay awake, his pulse pounding in his ears. Minutes felt like hours, and just as he began to drift off, the scratching returned. Louder this time, more insistent. Then came the voice, distorted and wrong. "Jonah." His blood ran cold. He hadn't told anyone his name. The walls of the cabin groaned, the wood straining as if under immense pressure. Shadows flickered across the ceiling, their movements jagged and unnatural. Jonah sat up, clutching the blanket like a lifeline. "Jonah," the voice repeated, rasping and guttural now. "Let me in." The cabin door rattled violently, the hinges groaning as though something massive was trying to force its way inside. Jonah backed into the corner, his eyes darting around the room. The shadows on the ceiling coalesced, forming a shape, a tall, impossibly thin figure with long, clawed fingers that reached for him. "Stay away!" Jonah screamed, but the figure only laughed, a deep, hollow sound that reverberated through his skull. Suddenly, the noise stopped. The cabin was still, the air heavy and suffocating. Jonah remained in the corner, too terrified to move. When dawn finally broke, the pale light filtering through the window, he dared to look around. The cabin was empty, but the door was wide open, its hinges twisted and splintered. Deep gouges marred the wooden frame, and the ground outside was littered with strange, claw-like tracks that led into the forest. Jonah bolted from the cabin, heading straight for the lodge. The old man was there, sitting on the porch with a grim expression. "You opened the door," the man said, shaking his head. There was something out there," Jonah stammered. "It called my name." The man sighed, his face lined with an expression of weary resignation. "They know you now. You'll never be rid of them." Jonah didn't wait to hear more. He jumped into his car, the fuel gauge forgotten, and sped away, the forest closing in behind him. But no matter how far he drove, the fog followed, and at night, when he closed his eyes, he could still hear it, the faint scratching at his door and the voice whispering his name.
Story number 9.
The small fishing village of Black Hollow was the kind of place people stumbled upon by accident and left with a vague sense of unease, unable to explain why. Nestled between jagged cliffs and a churning gray sea, it was perpetually cloaked in fog. Its residents were quiet, their eyes shadowed with secrets they never shared. Elliot wasn't supposed to be there. A wrong turn on a winding coastal highway had led him down the dirt road to Black Hollow, his GPS spinning uselessly as if the town didn't exist. Low on gas and far from any recognizable landmarks, he had little choice but to stop. The village was eerily still as he pulled into the only open establishment, a crumbling inn with a faded sign that read, "The Resting Tide." The woman at the front desk didn't smile as she handed him a key. Her hands trembled. "Stay in your room after dark," she said quietly, "and don't open the window." Elliot wanted to ask why, but the exhausted look in her eyes stopped him. He nodded and made his way to his room, a tiny space with peeling wallpaper and a single narrow window overlooking the fog-shrouded beach. By nightfall, the fog had thickened, pressing against the glass like a living thing. The sound of the waves had become a low, rhythmic pounding, almost like a heartbeat. Elliot lay in the lumpy bed, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible. A polite tap, tap, tap on the window. Elliot froze, his breath catching in his throat. He was on the second floor. The knock came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking on the window. The fog outside was so dense he could barely see beyond the glass, but there was movement, something shifting in the murk. A shadow, tall and angular, its form wrong in ways he couldn't quite define. Elliot clenched his fists, willing himself to stay in bed. He remembered the woman's warning. "Don't open the window." The shadow moved closer, pressing against the glass. Its outline became clearer. A face with hollow, empty eyes and a mouth stretched impossibly wide, grinning with too many teeth. "Let me in." A voice rasped, low and guttural, vibrating through the room. It didn't sound human. Elliot's pulse thundered in his ears. He clamped his hands over them, but the voice grew louder. "Let me in." The glass rattled in its frame, and a spiderweb of cracks appeared, spreading like veins. The creature outside began to press harder, the window bowing inward as if it were made of rubber. Suddenly, the pounding of the waves outside changed. The rhythm faltered, replaced by a new sound, a deep, resonant groan like the earth itself crying out. Elliot leapt from the bed and stumbled to the door. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. He banged on the doors of the other rooms, but no one answered. Panic clawed at his chest. The groaning sound grew louder, reverberating through the walls. It was coming from the beach. He shouldn't have looked. The moment he stepped outside, the cold, wet air slammed into him, and the fog seemed to wrap around his body, clinging to him like a second skin. He turned toward the shore and saw them, figures emerging from the water, their bodies slick and black, glistening in the faint moonlight. There were dozens of them, maybe more, their forms shifting between human and something far worse. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, like marionettes on tangled strings. The air reeked of salt and decay. The thing at his window was among them, taller than the rest. Its grin widened as it saw him, revealing rows of jagged teeth that seemed to stretch endlessly. Elliot stumbled back toward the inn, but the fog had thickened, swallowing the building. He turned in circles, trying to find his way, but the figures were closing in, their mouths opening to emit a terrible, guttural chant. The words were incomprehensible, ancient and wrong, but they resonated in his bones, shaking him to his core. As they surrounded him, the fog pressed closer, choking and suffocating. Elliot tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was that terrible, grinning face, its empty eyes gleaming with hunger. The next morning, the villagers found his car abandoned near the inn. The woman at the desk shook her head, muttering under her breath as she wiped her hands on her apron. "Shouldn't have stopped," she whispered to herself. They didn't bother to look for Elliot. No one who disappeared in Black Hollow was ever found.